Hi, I'm Reverend Jake Sabe, and welcome to Children's Bible Stories.
Almighty fortress is our God, a trusty shield and weapon.
Alright, children, welcome back to our Children's Reformation Stories, where we talk about some of the historical events surrounding the Lutheran Reformation. Today, we are going to focus on the Diet of Augsburg, but more specifically, we're going to talk about the foundational document of the Lutheran Church, the Augsburg Confession. So, in the 1500s, after the Diet of Worms, when Luther was excommunicated from the church, the Lutherans continued to preach and teach the truth and continued to argue and debate with the Roman Catholics. And what was happening, though, at this point in time is that the Muslim Turks were invading Europe. They were coming up from the region of Turkey and invading into what today is considered the country of Austria. So they were coming up from the southeast corner of Europe. And so the Muslims were invading, and the Christian kings were trying to keep the Muslims out. And this big fight between the Lutheran princes and the Catholic princes was meaning that the Holy Roman Empire was divided. And if the Lutherans and the Roman Catholics couldn't learn to work together, the Emperor, Charles V, was worried that the Muslims were going to overtake Europe. And so, he needed to work out some kind of peaceful agreement between the Lutherans and the Catholics. Now, Luther kept pushing for a church council, but the Roman Catholics didn't really want to do that. So instead, the emperor called together another diet, or diet. Now, diets weren't exactly the same thing as church councils. Church councils were normally where bishops and priests got together to discuss theology and to determine what the church was going to do. Diets were much more political, and while they did discuss theological matters, this was normally done in order to determine what the government was going to do. And so the emperor decided in 1530 on June 25th to call a diet at Augsburg. And so the Lutherans were to come to Augsburg and present their theological arguments where they agreed with the Catholics and where they disagreed with the Catholics. Now, because Luther had not only been kicked out of the church, he had also been declared an outlaw, which meant Luther was outside the law and that anybody could kill Luther on sight and not go to jail. And so Luther's life was in danger. The only reason Luther was still alive was because the Prince of Saxony gave Luther protection in Saxony. Augsburg was not in Saxony, and so there was no guarantee that if Luther went to Augsburg, that he wouldn't be put to death. So instead, Luther went and stayed at a place called Coburg, which was a little castle just on the border of Saxony, which was about a day's horse ride away from Augsburg, so that if the Lutherans at Augsburg needed Luther's help, they could just get on a horse, ride off to visit Luther, ask for his help, and then ride back to Augsburg. And so, since Luther couldn't come to Augsburg, the person who was left to represent the Lutherans at Augsburg was his friend Philip Melanchthon. And so this is where we also come to the document known as the Augsburg Confession. So, the Lutherans to this point in time had written a number of different confessional statements. When Luther and the reformer Zwingli had met at Marburg, the Lutherans and Zwingli had written a document known as the Marburg Articles. There is also another document the Lutherans wrote known as the Swalbach Articles. And there is a third document the Lutherans wrote known as the Torgau Articles. Now, the reason these articles are called the Torgau Articles is that in the lead-up to the Diet of Augsburg, Luther, Melanchthon, and some other theologians met in the city of Torgau, and they wrote a statement that they were going to present at the Diet of Augsburg. However, in the lead up to the Diet of Augsburg, the Catholic theologian Johann Eck had written his 404 theses condemning the Protestants, including the Lutherans. And the problem is that Eck had just put the Lutherans together with all the other Reformation groups, such as the Anabaptists and the Zwinglians and the Karlstadt and all these other guys who taught things differently to what Luther said. Luther didn't say a lot of silly, naughty things that all these other guys said, but Eck had just lumped Luther and Zwingli and Karlstadt and all of them together. And so the Lutherans decided that the Torgau Articles weren't going to be enough, because the Torgau Articles only said what the Catholics were doing is wrong. And so the Lutherans needed a new document that also said while Zwingli, Karlstadt, and the Anabaptists were wrong. And Luther left Melanchthon in charge to write this document called the Augsburg Confession. And so the Augsburg Confession is made up of 28 statements, or articles. The first 21 articles were meant to be the articles in which the Lutherans agreed with the Catholics and where they condemned the other Reformation groups. The last 7 articles, known as the Articles of Abuse, these were the articles written against where the Lutherans disagreed with the Roman Catholics. And so Melanchthon wrote this document and he presented it at the Diet of Augsburg. Now, what is interesting about this statement is that Luther was rather a very harsh, blunt man. He often called people names. He was often very strict, very mean sometimes in his writings, and was just very aggressive in how he talked to people. Whereas Melanchthon was much more gentle, much more peaceful, much more nice in how he talked to people. As Luther once said, "I am like a spear that is used to kill boars," whereas Melanchthon is more like a needle that just pokes you. And so Melanchthon was left in charge to write the Augsburg Confession, because the Lutherans knew that if they were going to have this meeting with the Catholics at Augsburg, they needed a statement that confessed the truth, but did so in a gentle, peaceful way. And you see, kids, in St. Peter's epistle, he says that whenever we give a defense for the faith, we need to do so with gentleness. We can't try and bash people into Christianity. We can't try and yell at them to make them Christians. We need to come to them gently. And so Melanchthon was left in charge to write this document known as the Augsburg Confession. And it was a very excellent document and became the foundational document for the Lutheran Church. Luther once says concerning the Augsburg Confession, "It really does please me, and I do not know anything that can be improved or changed about it. And I would not attempt it anyway, for I cannot step as so lightly and as quietly as Melanchthon does." And so Luther praised Melanchthon because he had written such a nice, peaceful, gentle confession. And so Melanchthon would go and present this document at the Diet of Augsburg. Sadly, the Catholics would reject this and would reject to have peace with the Lutherans at this time. But all of that, children, is a story for another day. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.